Erev Tov. I'll say a few words in Hebrew and then a few words in English. ברוכים הבאים למפגש השלישי שלנו במסגרת הסדרה על פריז והעיר המודרנית, פריז והמודרניות. ההרצאה הבאה בסדרה מתקיימת ביום ראשון הקרוב, והיא לא תהיה באולם הזה אלא באולם פולונסקי שהוא בבניין האחורי. באותה חצר, נכנסים דרך אותו ונליר, עוברים דרך אותה רחבה, אבל ממשיכים דרך דלתות הזכוכית לבניין החדש ויורדים למטה. בסדר? יהיו שלטים ותהיה הדרכה. פה מתקיים אירוע אחר ולכן אנחנו מקיימים את זה במקום השני, אולם גדול ויפה. It's a pleasure to have Professor Vanessa Schwartz with us from the University of Southern California. Vanessa got a PhD, finished a BA at Princeton and got a PhD at Berkeley in modern French history. And now currently she's a professor of history, art history, and film at the University of Southern California, where she directs the Visual Studies Research Institute. Over the years, she has held visiting professorships in Paris, Stanford, McGill, and this coming spring she'll be at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Vanessa's first book was Spectacular Realities, Early Mass Culture in Fin de Siècle, Paris, published by University of California in 1998, and was the first attempt of its kind to map mass culture, but also forms of visual culture that existed in Paris at the time, and to connect them to notions of modernity. She then went on to publish So French! Hollywood, Paris, and the Making of Cosmopolitan Film Culture. And later on, a few years ago, a short book, the very short introduction, to Modern France. She's edited several volumes, among them Getting the Picture, the Art History and Visual Culture of the News, as well as the wonderful Cinema and the Invention of Modern Life, which I think was pretty much a first of its kind, and the wonderful 19th century visual culture reader, more than 10 years ago already. She is the recipient of many fellowships and awards, including a Fulbright, the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the Getty Research Institute, and recently a Guggenheim Fellowship, and she is currently a fellow at the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library, where she's writing a book called Jet Age Aesthetics, The Glamour of Media in Motion, which is part of her interest or new interest in airports, the visual in airports, a wonderful project. Today she'll talk about modernity, and on Sunday she'll talk about film, showing us lots of clips from movies made in Paris and about Paris. I'm sure both events are going to be just wonderful, and I am welcoming Vanessa.
Good night, good evening. I want to thank Moshe, Sluhovsky, and Richard Cohen for organizing this lecture series and for being so generous as to have me come and participate. I'll try to speak slowly. I know that I tend to speak quickly, and so when it's your second language, I know it helps if you speak slowly. So if it looks like you really don't understand, I'll try to keep looking at you. But if you think I'm speaking too quickly, someone just can wave in the audience, and I will do my best to slow down. So I want to begin with this, which is a banner that appeared during the period, of course, of the Charlie Hebdo murders of nearly a year ago. It refers back to one of the best-known media events in history, the Dreyfus Affair, which shook Paris in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Now, it's one of the best-known media events because I'd also suggest it's one of the first media events. But here, in this Dreyfus is Charlie, we have a strange transposition that has the victim of slanderous cartoons, Dreyfus, identified with the death of cartoonists. In other words, what's interesting, I think, about this is as a memory, Dreyfus is a media maker rather than the subject of the news. So the affair, as it came to be known, concerned, and probably many people here are aware of it, the condemnation of a Jewish officer in the French army, Alfred Dreyfus, for spying on what turns out, of course, to be false charges. And then the story, the affair, is the drama that unfolds between 1894, the date of Dreyfus's original court-martial, and 1906, when vindicated, Dreyfus is awarded the Legion of Honor in the same courtyard which saw his degradation. And here, an image from 1895, of the degradation of Dreyfus in the courtyard of the École Militaire, and here in 1906, the reinstallation of Dreyfus. So, of course, the Dreyfus Affair is a well-known tale of anti-Semitism. It is known to be about the triumph, you could say, of the rights of man and of the power of the modern press. The press which, after all, published Émile Zola's notorious J'accuse of 1898, an editorial which led to Dreyfus's retrial and his eventual exoneration, although it was hardly a straight line from the editorial to the exoneration. Now, the Dreyfus Affair is also always told as an important story in the history of the press, and in particular about the power of the press and the press image. And so I show you here, for example, one of a kind of many kinds of press images, this one of a family at dinner and saying, whatever you do, don't talk about the Dreyfus Affair, and then on the bottom it says, someone talked about it. So the idea, of course, that the Dreyfus Affair split France, even within families, was one of the well-known elements to the affair, and here, again, you see that element in caricature. But there were also not just visual comments on the way France was divided, but also images such as this one, a well-known sort of legendary icon of anti-Semitism, Dreyfus as a kind of monstrous serpent with a traitor put through this monster. And I think what's actually really interesting, again, to bring it back to today, to think about the fact that as hateful and terrible as cartoon like this was, no one at the time thought to kill the cartoonists. Now, most of the images related to the Dreyfus Affair are illustrations and caricatures like this. And yet, the Dreyfus Affair began 55 years after the invention of photography, and in fact, the year that the movies themselves were introduced, and lasted during the whole period when the movies went from being kind of 30 seconds to actually 20-minute story films. The affair, in effect, I think is so alive today, not only because it's a kind of remarkable story, but because I think it is a quintessential occasion of a moment of news production during a period that I'd like us to think about as a period of media transition. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. Specifically, we see what seems sort of impossible to us today, that illustration was considered no less real than photography and film. So the history of photography and film is littered with debates and disputes over how real and true images are, that essentially images need to be naturalized through convention, and we think, of course, of the way that images can be faked now, but of course they were even faked then. And I just want to show you that as early as 1898, this was a book published called L'Affaire Dreyfus et l'image, the Dreyfus Affair and the image, an entire book dedicated to it. Here I want to emphasize this image by Vallotton of people reading the newspaper as this kind of activity and key element in the Dreyfus Affair, but it's an illustration. And 100% of the images in L'Affaire Dreyfus et l'image are illustrations, not a single photographic image is treated in this book. Now back to this issue of the idea, I want to draw your attention. There was a wonderful show at the Metropolitan Museum not long ago called Faking It, about the manipulation of photography. And what it suggests, and this is very important to my argument, is that from the very beginning, people were aware that photography could be faked, that you could actually alter an image. So while I think we rely on the photographic image as somehow more documentary than the illustration, and then we've become very obsessed with the fact that things like Photoshop and digital environment can easily fake images. In fact, people have always been aware that all images, photographic, cinematic, or of course illustrations by hand, can either be, as it were, real or fake. So last, I want to kind of, to set the stage here, have you consider this image. This is of Dreyfus on Devil's Island. And here it is an image from 1896. It is an illustration. No one thought to go to Devil's Island to take a photograph of Dreyfus. It isn't that they couldn't get there, it's that it was not necessary. The notion in the period that begins the Dreyfus Affair that you would, go all the way to Devil's Island, to French Guiana, essentially, to take a picture of Dreyfus made no sense. You would just draw a picture of Dreyfus at Devil's Island. So that's 1896, but amazingly, 10 years later, I want to draw your attention to this image, because this image is amazing. It's actually a postcard of the press with the army who were called the day before the rehabilitation of Dreyfus to come and to see how the ceremony would go so that the photographers would know how to set up their shots. So in between the illustration of Dreyfus on Devil's Island and only kind of 10 years later, we have this kind of pre-event meeting in which you essentially start to see what we would call a history of the event made through the camera. That in other words, in this 10 years' time, people started to understand that you could produce visual drama and instrumentalize the power of the camera in what we'll call historical moments. So we call these in English a kind of photo op, right? So here we have a history and a moment of the earliest measure of the photo op, which, as I said, in a sense, happens in the course, you could say, of the Dreyfus Affair. And by 1906, the end of the Dreyfus Affair, I want to suggest you also see cinema, and cinema starting to enter the news field. And in particular, these film stills are from the British Bioscope French company, their film company, where the fact of photographing and the presence of the photo reporter in these images, which is a major theme of my talk today, is already developing. And I just want to suggest down here, you see the photo, not just a crowd, but actually photographers. So the movie camera guy is taking pictures of the photographer. Here up there you see the family of Dreyfus walking, and again, without really regard for the camera. Here they have regard for the camera. Down here you see Dreyfus, he's kind of in a circle there, crossing the street. This is during the trial in Rennes, more on that in a moment, but also this last image where you can obviously see the presence of the photo reporter, not because he's in the picture, but here because the angle is taken from the roof. And so when you have an image like this, what you have a sense of is someone is standing on the roof taking that picture. So that is a picture of not just Dreyfus walking in the cour, the courtyard in Rennes. It is a picture which makes clear to those of us looking at the picture that someone is purposefully taking that picture. Okay, and that is going to be, again, a very important element to my discussion today of the history of photojournalism. So those are some of the qualities that I want to emphasize: the angles, the idea that someone had to get there to take this picture, that these people are in motion because a photographer is in motion. So my goal, in a sense, this evening is to suggest that we remember Dreyfus because of the role of the press and visual media in France, which is entirely connected to Parisian culture and its modern embrace of seeing the world as if it were a picture. In other words, I really want to ask questions about the history of the picturing of the news, whose importance emerged, I would suggest, in a broader culture of spectacle in late 19th century Paris. So I want to set the stage with a description of Paris in the late 19th century, in case you're not so familiar with it, then turn to the history of news pictures, and then focus on the emergence and the history of photojournalism in particular, and offer some material regarding ideas of space, physical presence, and speed in the history of news pictures that actually might help us understand the Dreyfus Affair much more clearly. And finally, I hope that we can connect the news image and the affair, I think, as a broad, and here I want to make another point, as a global event, one of the first global events, where technologies of media production and the history of actually transport infrastructures, so my interest in airplanes is also having me cast backward to the importance of actual vehicles and how they move the news, literally, so that we can see how the news teaches us to know the world, how this created a view of the world that is at once local and national and then global. So the Dreyfus Affair became a global news event and simultaneously reinvented Paris, this time as a news headquarters. Paris, because it was already the capital of the 19th century, as Walter Benjamin put it, has survived into the 20th century for many reasons, but not the least of which is because of the importance of Paris as a center of the news industry. And here I just show you an early image. This is from the mid-19th century of something called the Salle des Dépêches, where people would actually go and show up at the offices of the newspaper, and downstairs they'd be posting the news, kind of like how on CNN they do the scroll. You would go to the news office like Le Figaro or Le Temps, and in the news office they would actually post what the latest news was. So that goes back to the mid-19th century, but I think Dreyfus confirms the importance of France as a capital of the production of the news. Okay, so let's turn to Paris. And I want to use this as a transitional image to kind of get us back to the late 19th century, because what I love about this image is it's an ad for Microsoft. But it turns out, so you see the little computer window, but through the computer window, we are taken, in a sense, back through to the 19th century. And what are we going to see? We're going to see Montparnasse, and we're going to see, most importantly, on the right-hand side, a kind of a fake version of Jane Avril, a can-can dancer who was many times portrayed by Toulouse-Lautrec. And if you're interested in that, I will show you endless Toulouse-Lautrec clips the next time I speak. But in any event, so this kind of, what is French? Discover that's what's French, from Monet to Fries. But I want to especially focus here on the idea that Paris was the capital of the 19th century because it was the capital of spectacle and consumer culture. Paris, of course, you recognize this, was the most visited city in the world up until a few years ago. Actually, it was the most visited city in the world, the Eiffel Tower, built for the exposition of 1889. And one of the reasons Paris was so visited is because it held these world's fairs. In 1900, 52 million people visited Paris. That is more people than lived in all of France, visited in a 6-month period. In 1900, when there are no airplanes. So Paris, was a place visited, and in a sense, being a place visited, it became a place to be seen. But the other thing that I want us, we now look back and say, the Eiffel Tower, it's so 19th century. But of course, in 1889, when the Eiffel Tower was built, it was a beacon of modernity. Not only was it the highest structure built by humans in the world at the time, but the other salient detail about the Eiffel Tower is that it was built in 2 years' time. So to give you a contrast, the Washington Monument in the United States, which is kind of a big granite obelisk, took 40 years to build because it kept sinking into the ground. So in other words, this is not only a triumph of height, but of a certain technological modernity. The French were the world's great engineers. You probably know that because you're close to the Suez Canal here, close and yet so far, but in any event, and of course the French dug the Suez Canal. So they were the master engineers of the world. So part of what their modernity was a kind of a technological modernity, and the Eiffel Tower represents that as much as it represents, kind of for us, a sort of a beauty in engineering and in science, and it was a beacon, as it were, of progress. In addition, I showed you Jane Avril. Of course, Paris is known for entertainment. The Moulin Rouge, many of you are probably familiar with, but not only the Moulin Rouge, but this is a poster of the Moulin Rouge by the master of the poster himself, Jules Chéret. And the French were not only well known for entertainment, but they were known for advertising and for advancing many of the techniques of advertising, including the 4-color poster that you see here and that Chéret was really the master of. Of course, the department store is also invented in France, the modern department store. We can think of it as a cathedral of commerce. And here, a cathedral, even including the kind of stained glass, as it were, of the architecture at the top and the sides, so that this department store, and you can see how it's built, this is the Galerie Lafayette, was not just big and a spectacle of size, but also looking became central in these institutions. You didn't just shop to buy, you went to look. And that is a part of the transformation of modern consumer culture, the emphasis on its being a visual culture as well as, actually doing the business. Here again, I want to contrast the Chéret poster with Toulouse-Lautrec's advertisement for the same place. And what's interesting, and what I want to draw your attention to here in the contrast of the posters, is the Lautrec is somewhat later, and what you see in the Lautrec, of course, are dark silhouettes of the audience. So again, this is important because you now have advertisements that don't just solicit you, look at me. They're posters that say, you are looking. There you, the audience, are actually depicted. And so, to show how this kind of carries over into news culture. Here is an illustration from a newspaper, Le Monde Illustré. This is an illustration of the degradation ceremony of Dreyfus. But what you see here is not the ceremony of degradation. You see the people looking. You see the audience clamoring to see the ceremony of degradation, which I think is one of the elements here I'm trying to get at. Now, here, the Musée Grévin, which is what I wrote quite a lot of my first book about, was the Wax Museum of Paris, and it's still in this very same place. But what I actually want to draw your attention to, other than the crowd outside looking very clearly at the photographer, by the way, you can see them taking the picture, are these posters. So again, if I want to give you a sense of where were the posters were everywhere. The posters, in fact, were so everywhere that they were even at the theater. So this is a curtain for a theater production, but on the curtain were posters advertising other theater productions. So, and other forms of entertainment. So again, I want to make the point that the French were really masters of advertising. Now, I also want to draw your attention to the culture of the press, which also was very strongly related, strangely enough, you might think, to entertainment. Of course, we all think, in a way, now there's what we call the media circus. And we like to associate that with the degradation of American culture that's ruined the world in the 20th century. But I can assure you that the French ruined it first in the 19th century. So here I show you an illustration of a crime. This crime was a guy, stole someone's money and then boiled him in the mushroom cooker. But here is the Wax Museum. And the Wax Museum tableau of something that was first in the newspaper, because the Wax Museum claimed to be a three-dimensional newspaper. That was the idea behind the Wax Museum. So in other words, the newspaper became the basis for entertainment culture. So here you have another poster showing the crowd looking at the illustrated press with, of course, blood all over it. And the term fait divers is kind of like a crime story. They're, everyday horrible things that happened, and it's showing the audience, the crowd's taste for kind of bloody spectacle. Again, sound familiar? But here it is in the 19th century. And the crowd becomes essential in this story of the 19th century. And I want you to think about the crowd in French history was first a revolutionary crowd, but what happens by the late 19th century is, you could say, we still have the invocation of the crowd, but now, in a sense, they're the crowd of consumer culture. They're what we'll call the audience. And the city becomes a space for public display, and there are spaces that, of course, are publicity spaces. So I showed you those posters, but now I want you to see these kiosks. Here, I have another one. There, kiosks, which were actually public advertising spaces. So if you go to like Times Square in New York and you see all the, lit advertisements, there's a predecessor here in the 19th century in Paris. There are endless kind of banal paintings of Paris boulevards with people, a lot of people on the street looking at publicity. And here today still, we have the kiosk. They're called Colonne Maurice. This is by the Bourse in Paris. But again, just to give you a sense of the public space becoming a commercial space. It's one of the things I'm trying to emphasize. The other things that's essential for making posters, that is also essential for the press, is the technological revolution in the history of print. Not only the history of lithography, and so here I'm showing you a lithography shop, but also the rise of the steam press, which is to say the press that can make 1,000 posters within an hour, 1,000 newspapers within an hour. So you also have the massification of this kind of production. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that Parisian culture in the late 19th century kind of solidifies the coming to being of the consumer audience. We have a kind of transformation of the world to be consumed as a picture. And this is, of course, fundamental then to the history of news pictures, to which I now want to turn. And I'd like to consider this history by beginning with this painting. Let's consider this non-photographic mid-19th century visual source. It actually is a painting that sits today in the Hermitage. It's an old painting of a man standing on a boat with a sketchbook in hand, choosing between two subjects. It's painted by Jan de Hooij 6 years before photography and 2 years after the launch of the illustrated weekly newspaper, the Illustrated London News. This is a picture, I would suggest, about the art, the history, and the making of news pictures, called Willem van de Velde Sketching a Battle at Sea. It refers to a 17th century Dutch painter who was known, like all Dutch painters of the period, for the art of description. This picture is about the making of the news, and it draws our attention to many of the major issues concerning what I'll call the art of pictorial reporting that I think we need to understand. With a sketchbook in his hand, our reporter is actually physically on the move, intrepid, that means fearless, as he gets close to the action. The painting's two sites of action, the battle in the background and the human interest scenario in the foreground, underscore that a reporter chooses what to see and what to visually report. The painting shows how news facts are choices rather than mere transcriptions. Now, despite the proximity of the raft, in the foreground, the man with the sketch pad keeps his eyes trained on the big picture of the smoky battle, rather than kind of intervene in the human interest drama that's right before him. So in a way, this painting represents what I would call a familiar ethical critique of news reporters, who especially news picturers. So in other words, while his companion in the rowboat seems preoccupied with the nearby crisis, if you look at this artist, this guy in the rowboat, he is looking at the artist kind of like, what are you doing, right? With a degree of disapproval. Now, in 1845, when this was painted, it would have been hard to miss the allusions in this painting to Géricault's painting, the Hadoo La Medusa, which in its own day, a generation earlier, was actually thought to have dragged history painting down to the depth of illustration. And this, just to give you a sense of how slow the news cycle was, this was painted a full 3 years after the wreck of the Medusa, but it was considered a news illustration and not actually, in a sense, dignified enough to be a history painting, but I think we would consider 3 minutes a little too long in the news cycle. So if this mid-century tableau that we've been looking at, this one, acknowledges the challenges of painting in the face of the speedy onslaught of the news, it also perhaps transforms the painter into a sketch reporter. So while we may be taking stock of his actions, we are drawing attention instead in the painting to the way that the picture pictures the world outside of the frame. Now, a very well-known photographer turned historian of photography, Gisela Freund, since she was actually Austrian, who was the author of Photography and Society, said one of the most interesting things, I think, that relates to our story. She wrote, "The introduction of newspaper photography was a phenomenon of immense importance, one that changed the outlook of the masses. Before the first press pictures, the ordinary man could visualize only those events that took place near him, on his street, in his village. Photography opened a window. The faces of public personalities became familiar, and things happened all over the world that happened all over the world were his to share. As the reader's outlook expanded, the world began to shrink." So the idea that the world is made smaller through the news picture is something that I want us to also pause on as we talk about this history of news picturing and eventually circle back to the Dreyfus Affair. And I want to take you here to just some changes in news picturing with using some illustrations from the Dreyfus Affair. So on one side here is l'illustration, and on the other side, La Vie Illustrée. And it doesn't matter that you can't really see up close what's being pictured. I'll show you something up close in a minute. These are both reportings of the Dreyfus Affair. But what I want you to understand and look at is here on my right, your left, from l'illustration, very text heavy. And when you get to La Vie Illustrée, which used a lot of photographs, you start to see a new formatting of the news, which is to say the news photo essay, in which essentially, instead of using illustrations to just show a picture of what you've written, instead you start to have news stories in which the images narrate the story. And we have captions, and that, in a sense, is the news. Many people think of this as Life magazine, introducing this in America in the 30s, but again, it has a much older history in the history of news illustration from much earlier. So here I want to suggest the importance of the rise of what we'll call the illustrated press in the mid-19th century. This is a book called The Pictorial Press, Its Origin and Progress, already by the 1880s. The guy who wrote it, called Mason Jackson, was actually the art editor of the Illustrated London News, and he was interested in what he called the pictorial taste universal. He basically was struck by the idea that everyone wanted to see the news of the day illustrated by no matter what means possible. He felt that once we could consume the news in visual form, people would only want to consume the news in visual form. So again, he wrote this in the 1880s, but I think this is something that we all now pretty much take for granted. So where once we had, of course, illustrations, eventually photography replaces illustration. And I just want to show you here, sketch reporting started to be very common in the press. And if any of you know the essay by Charles Baudelaire called The Painter of Modern Life, it was about a newspaper sketch reporter named Constantin Guise. So even we talk about the idea of the painting of modern life, but in fact the painter of modern life that Baudelaire referred to was simply a news reporter. And notice how here is the Constantin Guise sketch, and then here you see it filled out. And that's how it was, filled out at the newspaper office by a kind of staff member after people came from the field. So what I want to emphasize here is both this idea that news photos and news illustration could shrink the world. Although Freund thought of it as only photos, I think we're already in agreement that actually it was photos and illustration. And I also want to suggest that essentially not only what's interesting about our man Constantin Guise is not just that he would illustrate the news quickly, but that he would go to the site of the news. So Robert Park, who is an American sociologist of the press in particular, said that the point of the press was to orient man and society in the actual world. And what I want to suggest is not just that, but that the point of the news image was to actually prove that humanity's role was to, in a sense, go all over the world, and that the photo reporter would be a substitute for us, that he would be our news proxy. And that is why I think photojournalism is so important. Now last, to kind of give you another theoretical angle on this, I want to simply quote Martin Heidegger. Because, of course, Martin Heidegger, as you may know, announced the following, quote, "The fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as a picture. In such producing, man contends for the position in which he can be that particular being who gives the measure and draws up the guidelines for everything that is." Now, such a phrase is very well known, generally, to people who study kind of modern philosophy. But I think the essential importance of such a phrase is not the usual observation that man creates a picture. I think that insight really, which is important, is not just the picturing, but the idea that he said man contends for the position. In other words, world picturing isn't a metaphor. It has come to include creating real pictures of the actual world made possible by the photographer actually physically taking a position, literally moving, literally traveling to get the picture. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that the news is about mobility. The news is about not just the world, but going all over the world. And let me remind you, if you want to kind of, again, 19th century summarized for us, here is a Currier and Ives 1876 lithograph of the progress of the century, made for another exposition, this one in Philadelphia, of 1876. And in this, you see here literally the window. You know how Giselle Freund mentioned the world through a window? Well, this even has a window, which I just put the arrow on. You also see here, again, the steam press. The first steam press was in England in 1814. Here, a kind of ticker tape that is made from a telegraph, of course, which has all kinds of homilies about bringing the world peace, and understanding by knowing other countries and other cultures of the world. More importantly, of course, my fixation, transport, the boat, the steamboat, and the train. This idea of the modernity hinging on the notion of, in a sense, steam power. Recall that until the train, nothing went faster than the speed of a horse for millennia. So that's a pretty big change there in the 1840s with the introduction of the train. And I think many of the things that we're talking about in the culture of the press are essentially made possible through this. Just to kind of give you a little information, this is the very first picture photograph ever reproduced in a newspaper in 1880 in the Daily Graphic. And actually, it's a scene of a shanty town, but really what its point was to simply show that they could actually reproduce photographs in newspapers. But it didn't take off. In fact, it wasn't until 1904, here in the Daily Mirror, that you have a newspaper that's only photographic images. It's also important to acknowledge the creation by Edouard Belin of the Belinographe, which is the first form of what we think of as a fax machine. So that there was image transmission via the Belinographe, very poor. They didn't make images that could be reproduced. And it's not actually until radio photo during World War II that we really have what we think of as transmission of photo over telegraphy. So that's something that happens quite a bit later in the century. So the halftone is an important thing for you to think about. In other words, that the press couldn't initially be photographic, even though photography is invented in 1839, right? But we're not really seeing a photographic press until well around 1900. So I think that's important to think about. Now, news reporting was very fixated, especially image reporting, on, of course, war. And the first photographed war was actually the Crimean War, and the great photographer of the Crimean War was Roger Fenton, and here you can see a Fenton photo, and then there you see these illustrations that were literally made based on photos. And they would always say at the bottom, this is an illustration based on a photo. So just to give you a sense, photography was very slow at the time, and so it's a lot of portraits. There's no battle scenes, right, that are photographed. The other thing I want to kind of emphasize here is how mobile photography is. Why is this? Well, in other words, in order to actually take pictures, you then had to develop them right on the spot. And so Fenton traveled with what he called his photographic van. It's a portable darkroom. He said it is, quote, the foundation of all my labors, the traveling darkroom, the carriage, which has already had an existence in Canterbury as a wine merchant's van. So he took this all the way to Crimea with him. He also took a servant, Marcus Sparling. And again, I just want you to think about, and here you can see this reproduced. So in other words, in the Illustrated London News, here's a picture that Fenton took of Sparling, and then you see the reproduction And you may know these pictures best of Fenton's. This is the Valley of the Shadow of Death. They've become endlessly discussed for the fact that the cannonballs are off the road and on the road, and there's a question, did Fenton put the cannonballs on the road? There's a very interesting book by Errol Morris called Believing is Seeing, if you're interested in this kind of stuff. But anyway, I thought you might be familiar with those pictures by Fenton if you didn't know who Fenton was. Just to show you again, photography was mobile. Here's Timothy O'Sullivan, who did important American survey photography with his photographic van. And last, I want to suggest here, this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1903. Again, it's a portable darkroom, and it says, at full speed, and what happens is the horse ran away, and the photographer was stuck in his portable darkroom. So again, the familiarity of photography being portable is one of the things that I'm trying to emphasize in this talk. Here, war photography continues well into the 20th century. You may recognize this guy, Robert Capa, who actually took very, very interesting and important pictures, actually, of Israel in 1948, and actually also made a very not so well-known 18-minute film for UJA, actually, of Israel in 1947, which is remarkable film, and I have seen, and it's great in terms of all the cliches of, independence. There's a lot of horrors, and anyway, it's a great film. So, look out for Robert Capa's film on this. But in any event, here I want to show you Capa as a reporter on the move, in front of an airplane, in a landing field. Here are the famous D-Day pictures. But again, the picture is taken so you can see the photographer is in the boat, on the boat. I am there. I traveled, I journeyed. That's why he wants to take this picture, where you can obviously see that the photographer is in the boat with them. And then, of course, the picture of the soldiers doing the debarkation, on D-Day. Here, Ouija. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the photographer Ouija, but he was known to have his own photographic car. That a specially equipped car, where you could develop pictures. So again, we see the emergence of a vehicle specially designed for photographers. The paparazzi are motorini. They have mopeds, right? Also always on the move. And last, my favorite photographer, Ron Galella, who's the guy who chased Jackie Onassis around and was actually, and sued her. In effect, for barring his ability to take her picture, but again, running and being in front of a car. Finally, also, Jimmy Hare was one of the most famous war photographers of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And again, you see here, he's got his photographic tent. It says Hare, and this, by the way, again, reproduced in l'illustration. In fact, Hare went to no ends, and what's interesting about this picture is you have the photographer on an airplane, right? So what is interesting, I'm suggesting, is that all of these photographers have themselves depicted in motion, right? And then many of their photographs themselves suggest not just that they got close to the action, but that they were mobile people. And that's one of the points I'm trying to make here. Last, I want to just talk about the fact that this is made possible by the history of cameras, and in particular the miniaturization of the camera. Here you see Eric Solomon, who was one of the first guys to actually use the term photojournalist. He's German. He died in Auschwitz, but he was known to take pictures of dignitaries during World War I, signing the Treaty of Versailles, etc., in World War I, because he was a kind of, upper bourgeois German guy. The Erminox camera, a small format camera. So not only was the photographer mobile, but this mobility pushed technology to make smaller and smaller cameras that like the Leica. And of course, the Leica is it's a German camera. The Germans are probably the most important innovators in camera technology in the 20s and 30s, and actually that's one of the reasons why the Japanese become great camera people because, of course, they collaborated with the Germans in the 30s, and they exchanged a lot of know-how over camera technology. And in fact, we then stole, the Americans stole a lot of things from the Germans. We captured a lot of information, including how they did their miniature cameras and their lenses. And so that's one of the spoils of war, actually, in the history of photography and its portability. So photography gets more portable, and my point is it also gets really speedy. So let me just read you a quote, again, just to prove my point. This is in a book about the history of photojournalism called Get the Picture, 1938. From the first days of the news picture, newspapers and picture syndicates have used every means of conveyance to bring the reproduction of the event before the eyes of the reader. From the interior of China, the donkey and rickshaw have brought the flood and famine pictures. The carrier pigeon carried the film in Japan. Native runners brought the pictures from the jungle interiors. Dog sleds bore the negative from the Arctic wastes. Every known vehicle in Europe and America has expedited the photograph, the automobile, the train, the airplane, the dirigible, the motorcycle. So, in other words, according to this history of the profession, what news people started to be good at was charting boats and trains. This is what they did, and why, in this book, Ezekson says, speed, speed, and more speed became the battle cry for the score of editors. So, although Walter Benjamin observed of photography that it brings the far-flung world to meet the beholder halfway, what I've been trying to suggest is that he had it wrong by half. In fact, photography and news pictures were about going all the way there. Their importance hinged on the fact that they stood as evidence of the mobility afforded by the modern world as much as by the news that they conveyed in and of themselves. So, what I want to kind of emphasize then here in this general account that I've given you of news pictures is the role of the photographer and the production of images rather than on what's in the picture. In other words, this making of the picture is really important, including to trying to understand the history of things like the Dreyfus Affair. So photojournalism has mattered for the physical positions taken by photographers, positions that are always represented in the pictures of the news themselves. In other words, that's the way in which I'm using getting the picture. We are getting the picture because we see the photographer getting the picture. So to return to Paris and Dreyfus one last time. The historian Michael Burns showed us that peasants in the countryside far from Paris, said, "Qui ça, Dreyfus?" Who is this Dreyfus? As a means to suggest that while Paris was obsessed with the Dreyfus Affair, the rest of France had a long way to catch up to Paris. That despite the expansion of the press, there were places that we would call news-starved. But I'm really hoping to suggest the opposite, that the power of the media image and its mobility is in how it transcended, and it continues to transcend, national borders and travel across space. And what that does is create a global consciousness and a global culture. But at the same time, it does this by reinscribing places like Paris as news hubs. So here you have the first news agency in the world, the Agence Havas. This is the building. And this is the exit by workers, you know, in the middle of the day or the end of the day. The Agence Havas was founded in 1832 as the first news agency in the world. So the affair, the Dreyfus Affair, if you want to rethink it, can be reconsidered as a spatial event. Dreyfus traveled all the way to Devil's Island. There was a second trial in the western city of Rennes, not in Paris, so again it moves from Paris to Rennes. Émile Zola, that guy who wrote J'accuse, actually leaves France and flees to England to run away for being convicted himself American and British film companies made films. For all of you, you're probably much more familiar with the fact that Theodor Herzl, a foreign correspondent from Vienna, fixes on the Zionist dream during the trial in the Dreyfus Affair. So if the trial itself was a global affair, it's no wonder that you could also then read about it in American magazines like Harper's or Vanity Fair here. But here you can still see that photography was pretty insufficient. This is a picture taken of where they were holding Dreyfus in prison in the Sketch magazine of 1899, not the kind of exciting news reporting that we are used to. This, for example, is much more interesting as an image, the sketch that appeared in Vanity Fair in the same year. So again, you can see why illustration lasts so long, because in fact, it was far more visually interesting than what photography could do at the time, I would suggest. In 1914, you had to have photos, but they still weren't that interesting. So here you have Dreyfus again in 1914. Dreyfus is a lieutenant in World War I. It's not much of a picture, although I do think that their eyes trained on Dreyfus is fairly interesting. But then, and this is my point, in 1927, on the isle that is the world's end, an image, and it says, this is where Dreyfus was in prison. This is from 1927. So by 1927, of course people were going to Devil's Island to show you like the place where Dreyfus had been. So in other words, in this story that I've told, you had an illustration of Dreyfus where no one would have thought to go to Devil's Island. Then you have photographs that can't do much. And finally, you have the kind of news culture that we're familiar with, where, in effect, of course, people are going all the way to Devil's Island to take a picture. So understanding the powerful role of news images in all their varieties, cinematic, photographic, and illustrated, and I would suggest this continues to cohabit even today, images that at once embed the mobility of their maker within their frame, and which take their own journeys via a web of interconnected media, reminds us that it's the mobility and the pace of the press image that defines what it means to get the picture then, and this continues until now. So the late 19th century produced a media culture in which press hubs such as Paris, the place that, as it were, invented modern life, could make events like the Dreyfus Affair possible. The world came back via the image. But finally, I hope I've persuaded you, it's the position of image taking itself, whether here in Rennes in 1899, the position of taking the image on the top, Rennes in 1899, here Paris in 2015, January, during the Charlie Hebdo, massacre, and finally, and unfortunately, the most recent set of images of the Bataclan murder, that these images convey as much as the news that they report. Thanks.